to this third of 4 panel discussions on the laity and the governance of the Church. It is customary on these occasions for the chairman to introduce the speakers. But since at least 3 of the 4 speakers are well known to you already, though I shall eventually introduce them, I might as well also introduce myself. My name is Nicholas Lash. I am, as you may gather from the accent, what the US immigration authorities lovingly refer to as an alien, and I come to Boston College for a few weeks each year to get educated. The first 3 of these 4 sessions, this being the third, roughly refer, I think, to past, present and future of the problems of the laity and the governance of the Church. The first session, which I'm sure most of you were at, was on the early Church. The second one on pastoral issues in the contemporary Church, and this evening on legitimate expectations. It's traditional academic practice that you gather together 4 people who are immensely erudite. They're vastly learned in their knowledge of some small slice of our past, and you ask them now to talk about the future, about which they know more than the rest of us. From my immediate left, I'm working across towards the door, because this is the order in which they are going to speak. Father Michael Buckley, who was a graduate of the University of Chicago. His dissertation was published by Princeton, and eventually the book was entitled Motion and Motion's God, really heavyweight stuff in the history and philosophy and theology of science. He taught for 18 years at the Jesuit School of Theology at Berkeley, was a visiting professor at the Gregorian University in Rome. He was for 2 years the executive director of the Committee on Doctrine of the Episcopal Conference of this country, and then for 3 years he was a professor at the University of Notre Dame. But not being a football fan, he moved to Boston College in 1990. I never said that. A few years ago, he gave the Darcy lectures in Oxford, University of Oxford, on the dialectical structure of modern atheism, lectures which in some measure reflected the argument of what is perhaps his most outstandingly important and influential publication to date, that is a study of the structure of modern atheism. I won't run through his list of publications. Life is too short for that. I'll move swiftly on his left, Father Michael Hines, who served for 10 years as Dean of the Seminary of the Immaculate Conception at Huntingdon, Long Island. I know that because in that vast building, my poor son, who made his first communion there one Good Friday many years ago, got lost in the corridors. Father Hines was then a member of the theology faculty of the University of Notre Dame, where he acted as director of the collegiate program in theology. He joined the faculty here at BC in 1993 and is now professor of theology here. His books include Doing the Truth in Love, Fullness of Faith, and Ongoing Incarnation, and he has a soft spot for 19th century German culture and for Osso Bucco. On his left, Father John Beale, who is a priest of the Diocese of Erie, Pennsylvania, who was ordained in 1974 after theological studies at the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium. From 1973 to 1980, he was a teacher and administrator at Elk County Christian High School in St. Mary's, Pennsylvania. In 1985, he received his doctorate in canon law from the Catholic University of America. From 1984 to 1992, he served as judicial vicar of the Diocese of Erie. And in 1992, he joined the faculty of what is now the School of Canon Law at the Catholic University, where he's now associate professor. And he was co-editor and a contributor to a new commentary on the Code of Canon Law, sponsored by the Canon Law Society of America and published by the Paulist Press in 2000. He's published a considerable number of articles and has on several occasions addressed the annual convention of the Canon Law Society of America. And then, if he wants summer in winter, he's also addressed the Canon Law Society of Australia and New Zealand. And finally, on my far left, Sister Mary Ann Hinsdale is Associate Professor of Theology and in the Theology faculty here and Director of the Institute of Religious Education and Pastoral Ministry. She is a sister of the Servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. And she holds degrees from Marygrove College, from Catholic University, from Regis College, Toronto, and the University of St. Michael's College in Toronto. She is Secretary of the Catholic Theological Society of America and a trustee of Marygrove College. She co-authored a volume, It Comes from the People, Community Development and Local Theology, and has co-authored 2 other books and has published a series of learned articles. Before coming to BC, Dr. Hinsdale was chairperson of the Religious Studies Department at the College of Holy Cross. Now, each of our 4 speakers is going to speak for what the chairman will try to ensure is a little over 15 minutes. And that way, I hope we shall have ample time for, with luck, some 45 minutes general discussion and contributions from yourselves towards the end. It now gives me then great pleasure to ask Father Michael Buckley to speak to us on resources from the first millennium.
Thank you very much. Allow me to introduce my remarks this evening by specifying both the problematic situation out of which they arise and the question they attempt to address. The problematic situation that we confront this evening is not directly the horror and scandal of clerical sexual abuse, but what is implicated in it. The present crisis in executive leadership in the Church, the significant diminishment of credibility and the leadership of bishops and of the Holy See, an event that is unparalleled, I believe, in the history of the Church in the United States. The particular question that these reflections hope to explore is this: what resources does the first millennium of the Church offer to address this crisis, especially as it touches upon laity and the government of the Church? Now, obviously, such a question is entirely too vast for a 15-minute comment. But let me, without naively canonizing that first century of the Church, let me make 4 very fragmentary but still concrete suggestions that retrieve convictions and practices from those years. Ideas that we may well incorporate in the Church of the future. The first: we must restore to the local church and hence to the laity what it possessed for so much of that period: a decisive voice in the selection of its own bishop. In the 3rd century, for example, the selection of bishops was shared in a vital way by 3 parties: the laity of the local church, the clergy of the local church, and the bishops of that region. This was done in different manners, but all 3 components were present and vitally influential during the process. Hippolytus, for example, insists that the bishop is to be chosen first of all by the people, and that this selection is to be approved subsequently by the assembled bishops and presbyters. One can find a similar double election in the 3rd century life of Polycarp. Now, the shifting of this popular suffrage in the Church to an acclamation or rejection by the laity of the choice of the priests or bishops seems to have taken place in the centuries that followed. But whatever the local usage, it is very important to register that even in the great lay investiture struggles between Gregory VII and Henry IV in the 11th century, the effort of the papacy was not to transfer power from the secular lords to the Holy See, but, as Hen has written perceptively, to win the freedom of the local church in the selection of their bishop. Now, why do I give this particular retrieval pride of place? Because, very simply, I think we would get better bishops. I think that the committed Catholic laity and the clergy of a locale, working possibly through diocesan pastoral councils or priest senate, would be in a far better position to judge both the serious needs of the diocese and the religious capacity of the candidates, much better than a papal nuncio under the influence of those whom he had chosen to consult. It is quite simply scandalous to hear in diocese after diocese from the local clergy their fears about who will be imposed upon them because of social connections or ecclesial influence, or to listen to their discouragement that so-and-so has been appointed because of his close friendship with some powerful ecclesiastic. As late as the Council of Reims in 1049, presided over by Leo IX, the Gregorian formula appeared and was to reappear again and again in the centuries that followed. I quote, "The bishop must be chosen by the clergy and by the people." There is nothing in the first millennium in the history of the Church to suggest that the primacy of the Roman See should entitle its occupant to determine who is to be the bishop of every see in the Church. There are many reasons that have led to the present settlement as the Church struggled successively for its freedom from political control and from the hegemony of the absolute state. But we must recognize that those days are for the most part gone, and that the Church would profit immensely from retrieving something of the freedom and self-direction of the local Church enjoyed in the first millennium. That is my first suggestion. The second suggestion that I submit for your consideration is this. The Church should restore the canonical prohibition of a bishop leaving one see for another. The 15th canon of Nicaea, the 5th canon of Chalcedon, and many regional councils insistently forbade bishops from moving from see to see. For the bishop was considered bound to his people by a mystical union that was expressed as being akin to the marriage bond. Thus the Council of Alexandria in 338 called such a translated bishop from one see to another an adulterer. Paradoxically, no see in the first millennium was more faithful to these canonical stipulations than Rome itself. It never elected a previous bishop from another see to become Bishop of Rome until Marinus I in 1882, whose pontificate was followed by the horrors of the papacy at the end of the 9th century and most of the 10th. Now, why such an insistence? Because the early Church saw in this effort to move from see to see an endless source of clerical ambition, rivalry, and self-promotion, as well as the violation of the union that should exist between the bishop and the people of his diocese. In 342, the Council of Sardica very sarcastically wrote, I quote, "Almost no bishop who is found who will move from a large city to a small one, whence it appears that they are inflamed by the heat of avarice to serve ambition." Now that ambition and its correlative fears can tempt one to adjust his statements and his positions in order to cultivate a higher authority who could advance his cause. If you look at the major sees in the United States today, almost every bishop there has advanced from a lesser diocese to a greater. This is a system that effectively turns these lesser sees into farm teams to prepare men for the big leagues, rather than a people sacred, in whom the bishop had, in a sacred and unbreakable bond, the bishop had invested his life. And so my first suggestion, taken from the first millennium, urges the laity's voice in the selection of its bishop. The second deals with the mutual commitment of the bishop and his people to one another for life. Both suggestions would correct a contemporary settlement in the Church that most Christians of the first century, quite honestly, would have considered corrupt and corrupting. My third suggestion: we need to restore or to strengthen Episcopal conferences and regional councils. The history of the first centuries of the Church bear witness to innumerable regional gatherings of the bishop of local churches in Asia, Africa, and Spain. This was how the Church was governed. Over 400 synods and meetings of bishops, Eastern and Western, are known to have been held between the mid-2nd century and the pontificate of Pope Gregory the Great. Most were small local or provincial gatherings, but others included all the bishops of larger political regions, or what were called dioceses. The purpose of these meetings was multiple, but all of them bore upon the responsibility of the region to settle its own serious problems, whether of doctrine, or of order, or of discipline. There is an hilarious remark by the pagan historian Ammianus Marcellinus, and I quote, that the public transportation system during the reign of Constantius II was paralyzed by the Christian bishops traveling to and fro to their numerous synods at imperial expense. Now, I'd like to bring that back. But by means of these regional meetings, the local churches could and did govern themselves. And if massive and intractable internal contradictions occurred, then the issue could be referred to the Apostolic See. But this relatively rare practice itself was susceptible of great variation. The historical situation continued very complex, but by and large, Rome did not interfere in the daily life of the churches in Africa, Asia, or Spain, or attempt to govern them. On the contrary, it acted occasionally to protect the integrity and freedom of the local church. It was Julius I who intervened to protest the deposition of Athanasius from the See of Alexandria. It was Innocent I who came to the defense of John Chrysostom in Constantinople. And as mentioned previously, even the massive claims of Gregory VII were introduced to safeguard the freedom of the local church. Now it seems to me that the present crisis of the situation of the church today could hardly be greater. I think it is fair to say that the church has never in its history been so centralized as it has become today. A centralization abetted by the modern means of transportation and communication. Episcopal conferences have been crippled in their practices and deprived of much of their authority by recent provisions of the Holy See. The curious treatment of the International Commission on English in the Liturgy has been cited by Bishops Troutman and Maurice Taylor as simply scandalous, while virtually unanimous decisions of national hierarchies have been set aside by Roman congregations. Almost everything in the Church is ruled by Roman prescription or Roman officials, despite the increasing anger that this assumption of authority is awakening. There is a restiveness of the Church in the United States that is unprecedented. And I honestly wonder if very neuralgic issues, such as the ordination of women and the prohibition of artificial contraception, would not have been handled more successfully, more pastorally, if these issues had made their way through careful conversations among regional and national conferences before being considered by the Holy See. That Rome should encourage and support strong regional and national Episcopal conferences, which would incorporate the experiences of the members of the local churches, is in no way contrary to the primacy of the Roman See. On the contrary, it would realize very much of the purpose of that primacy. Finally, number 4, to counter the present excessive centralization within the Church, certain institutions that may at one time have served a useful purpose need to be reconsidered and possibly abolished. I think of such institutions, for example, as the College of Cardinals, the Office of Papal Nuncio, and even the honorific attachments to the Papal Court as Monsignor. Theologically or sacramentally, the Sacred College is not the College of Cardinals, it is the College of Bishops. The origin of the College of Cardinals is obscure, but for all its variation, it bespeaks four functions within the Roman Church: to advise the Pope, to elect the Pope, to execute various papal offices, to govern the Church when there is no Pope. But de facto, cardinals are given precedence even over bishops and patriarchs, whose function is not primarily to advise the Pope, but actually to govern and lead the Church with the Pope. It might make much better ecclesial sense, especially with the growing international position of the papacy, to have the presidents of the Episcopal Conference elect the Pope, who would be bishops in vital contact with their own churches. I wonder further if the Papal Nuncio was not a novelty we should reconsider. 3 minutes, thank you. We have 3 minutes to reconsider the Nuncio. I wonder further if the Papal Nuncio was not a novelty we should reconsider, a Roman representative to a secular government. I think it makes a good deal of sense to have an apostolic delegate represent the Holy Father to the Church of the United States. But the representation of the Church in the United States to the body politic should be through its bishops, its peoples, and its own officials. What is sacramentally important is that the College of Bishops, with the Pope as its head, and in vital, effective contact with the people who constitute the Church, actually represent the Church. These are the four suggestions I submit for our consideration, and I submit them because I think the Church is still very young. It is only 2,000 years old, still growing, and set into a world that will last for many more hundreds of thousands of centuries. There is nothing in these suggestions that a very ordinary theology of the Church could not sanction tomorrow. It may seem to you that they evince a restless discontent. That is not the case. I reverence the Church deeply and experience it as holy, whatever its history of sins, defects, and failures. But it is this very vocation to holiness that dictates the need for continual self-examination and reform. And to meet that need, I think we have much to learn for our first 1,000 years. Thank you.
On the business of Monsignori, I remember more than 30 years ago, the then Bishop of the Diocese of Northampton in England was asked by a friend why there were no Monsignori in the Diocese of Northampton, and his reply was, if the Pope wants courtiers, I don't see why he shouldn't have them, but I don't see why he should have my priests. It now gives me very great pleasure to ask Father Michael Himes to speak of resources from the 19th century.
Let me say this is already a historic gathering. It's the first time in 16 centuries that Ammianus Marcellinus got a laugh. I have 4 points and, if time, a concluding comment, which I can't waive if we're tight, about resources to be found in the 19th century. The first is a very general comment. One of the issues that preoccupied 19th century scholarship in many, many fields, certainly in the realm of theology, was the emergence of the importance of historical criticism, of an awareness of the fact that church institutions, forms of worship, doctrinal formulations had grown over the course of time, had been affected by historical events and currents, both in and outside the Christian community, that some had not only grown, some had decayed. That was a big struggle in the 19th century. We all remember 1845, Cardinal Newman's great essay on the development of Christian doctrine. It is sometimes thought that what Newman was doing was giving a theory of development of doctrine. If you have read the book, you know, in fact, that is not quite what he's doing at all. He says that he's advancing an hypothesis to account for a difficulty. And the difficulty is that nothing in Europe, in any of the churches, in his own at the time he began the book, his own Anglican community, in the Roman Catholic community, or in the continental Protestant communities, none of them looked like the church he found described in the Pauline epistles or the Acts of the Apostles. That was the difficulty. The hypothesis was things develop. He wasn't explaining how they developed. He was simply arguing that they developed. The very idea that there could be such a thing as development of doctrine was something that was startling in 1845. It was a big struggle throughout the 19th century, and it obviously has not yet been won at the beginning of the 21st century. I mentioned, for example, the week before last, a spokesperson for the Archdiocese of Boston said in the Boston Globe, was quoted as saying, speaking of the initiative here at Boston College, the Church of the 21st Century, which Father Leahy so wonderfully announced. He said, of course you can discuss anything you like, and it should be discussed, but we must remember that there are structures in the church, the fundamental structures of leadership in the church were given by Christ to the apostles and then to us. Well, of course, that's simple nonsense. And it seems to me, my suspicion is, that if we could get the person in question to sit down for a few moments and say, now listen, do you really mean that? That on a particular afternoon, Jesus got the 12 together and said to them, bishops every place, one in a diocese, presbyters, deacons, minor orders, don't worry about them, you can develop those. But the others, I'm giving you right now. I mean, I'm certain the person would say, no, of course I don't mean that. But that's what he said. And we say that kind of nonsense far too often and far too easily. We have turned for too long the word tradition from the name of a process into a description for how there is no process. So the tradition becomes the story of how things never changed, rather than the ongoing story of change, growth, and development, and sometimes decay and disappearance. It is extremely important that all of us, members of the Catholic community, certainly those in leadership in the Catholic community, attend to that reality much more carefully and much less frequently and easily appeal to, this was all established by Christ and is simply passed on to us. We can do nothing about it. My second point. In 1819, Johann Sebastian Dry, Dr. Lash referred to my affection for the 19th century and Ossobuco. Alas, I carry the Ossobuco around with me in a way that I don't the 19th century. In 1819, Johann Sebastian Dry, an enormously influential figure at the Catholic Theological Faculty in Tübingen, which was to become a seedbed for some of the most interesting and important developments in Catholic thought in the 19th century, Dry published a small book called A Brief Introduction to the Study of Theology. It's a series of numbered propositions, and the 342nd of those propositions. It is, after all, a German book. By proposition 342, he's coming to the end of the introduction. He wrote, there must exist in the church something analogous to what within the state is called public opinion. Now that's a very interesting claim, that in the Christian community, in the church, there is something analogous to what one might call in civil society public opinion. What did Dry mean by the term? Well, the next proposition, 343, explains it a bit. Church government, he says, neither can nor ought to suppress the activity and influence of individuals which are addressed to the church at large through the spoken or written word, because it would at the same time deprive itself of the devotion and insight inherent in the vast number of its members. But neither can a church government acknowledge or admit an influence acting in this way, which is not directed toward preserving and edifying the church. Thus, there ought to be maxims for church governance, such that free expression of religious zeal and insight can indeed exist, and yet the church can restrain by appropriate means the dangers which might possibly arise on occasion. Now, two things I want to emphasize in that passage. One, notice it becomes obvious as you read that passage and subsequent passages that what Dry is thinking of as public opinion is essentially the opinion of theologians. It's people who write and lecture in theology. He's not thinking yet of the whole community of the church. But secondly, please notice, he thinks there ought to be maxims. Now, in Dry's language, maxims meant fundamental norms, which would govern how this public opinion, this sense of the theological community, could find expression. I suggest to you, this is my first concrete suggestion, that remains an enormously important issue at the present time. It becomes more important because my third point, which is going to deal with the widening of the field of public opinion in the church. We do not have any viable institutions, any guidelines within the church which establish fora in which that public opinion can be expressed and be heard and debated by all members of the community. No such fora still exist in the church. Until they exist, public opinion is always going to be, to some extent, stifled in the life of the church. Indeed, theological opinion is often stifled in the life of the church. My third point. In 1859, John Henry Newman, by that point a Roman Catholic for some 14 years, published an essay in the Rambler, a famous essay entitled On Consulting the Faithful in Matters of Doctrine. In it, Newman raised the image of the sensus fidelium, or as he preferred to call it, the consensus fidelium, the sense or consensus of the faithful. This is what Newman said about it. He described it in 5 ways. He said that you could think of this sensus fidelium as, first, a testimony to the fact of apostolical doctrine. That it was a testimony to as you looked at the sense of the faithful, the way in which the Christian community prayed and lived and taught the faith to the next generation over the course of centuries, that you saw a continuity which was a testimony to the apostolic nature of doctrine. Secondly, he said, it was a sort of instinct, or, and he uses an interesting Greek term, a phronema, deep in the bosom of the mystical body of Christ. I'll come back to that one. Thirdly, it is a direction of the Holy Spirit. This is the work of God. It is fostered by the Holy Spirit. Therefore, fourthly, it is an answer to the prayer of the church. And finally, it is, he says, a jealousy of error, which it at once feels as a scandal. He spends the most time talking about the first and the fifth of those 5 descriptions. I agree with that, but the fifth is essentially, you notice, negative. The faithful recognize when something is proposed that is false. They recognize it not to be true. Is there a positive sense to the sensus fidelium? Is there a time when the sense of the faithful not only recognizes that something is false, but recognizes that something else is true? That leads me back to his second one, a sort of instinct or phronema. He's taking that term, I think, from Aristotle, especially from the Nicomachean Ethics. And it refers to something learned through concrete personal experience. As, for example, the way in which one might learn to be a good painter or a good shoemaker. You become a painter by apprenticing yourself to a painter. And by living with the painter and working with the painter and learning from the painter, bit by bit you pick up the techniques of a good painter. That's how you become a shoemaker or a baker. Well, Newman suggests, it may be that the way in which the Christian community, as it were, picks up the faith is by living with one another. That all of us are, as it were, by our baptisms, entered as apprentices into a community of faith. A community of people who pray, who worship, who live the Christian life, and who profess the Christian creed. And we learn how to pray, how to live, and what we profess, we learn what it means by living with those people. I suggest to you that what he is doing is taking Dry's notion of public opinion and immensely expanding it. It's now no longer simply the theological community. It is all the faithful who have some voice in the understanding of the church's doctrine, its meaning, the understanding of the church's prayer, and its meaning. That, if anything, further complicates the problem of what is the forum in which this is heard. Recently, at their meeting in Dallas, Margaret O'Brien Steinfeld made a very perceptive comment indeed, I thought, to the American bishops when she said possibly the most scandalous thing she could say about the state of the church 40 years after Vatican II was that even at this point, for her as a laywoman, the only way she could make her voice effectively heard was by refusing to contribute. If the collection basket is the only forum available for the expression of the opinion of the laity, the consensus fidelium, then there is a great deal of reform needed. 3 minutes. My fourth point. And you've got 3 minutes to do that reforming, too. My fourth point. In 1877, Newman published a third edition to a work of his originally published 40 years earlier, entitled The Via Media, the Lectures on the Prophetical Office of the Church. In that remarkable preface, the last document of any length that he published in the course of his lifetime, Newman suggested a very different structure from anything that could be described as a pyramidal structure to the church. He took the familiar image of Christ as exercising three offices, priest, prophet, and king, and suggested that since the church continues the work of Christ, it too exercises the offices of priest, prophet, and king. But, Newman suggested, whereas in Christ those three offices are exercised in perfect harmony, in the church that is not the case. That in fact these three offices, the sanctifying office of the church, the office of prayer and the teaching of prayer and the deepening of our spiritual lives, which he suggested is centered in the local church, the parish, and I would suggest the family, the domestic church. The prophetic office or the teaching office of the church, which Newman located not in the hierarchy, but in the theological schools, and the kingly office of the church, the governing office that seeks the common good of the whole community, which is what he thought was the role of the Pope and bishops, the hierarchical role, that those three functions are exercised in the church with a certain amount of friction, and that friction is what keeps them healthy. He concluded his preface with a line that could have been Ralph Waldo Emerson's, actually. He said, "Nothing great and living is ever wholly consistent with itself." Or, if I can reverse that, if you have a church that is functioning in perfect harmony, it is small and dead. That, in fact, these three offices, in order to function healthily, must, to use a good American image, check and balance one another. At no point does he refer to the American Constitution, but it's very much that kind of image that Newman suggests. If so, I suggest to you that we might turn to Cardinal Newman for a charter for what is happening throughout the Church of the United States, what is happening in the Church of Boston, and what is happening in the community of this campus at this moment, namely a certain amount of very healthy friction. Thank God, about time.
Thank you. Second, Michael, very much indeed. The first lectures I ever gave in this country were in 1970 in the University of Notre Dame. And, somebody said, "What are you lecturing on?" And I said, "Well, the chairman of the department thinks I'm talking about doctrinal development. In fact, I'm going to try and persuade them that it changes." I think of that because of the importance, it seems to me, of Father Hyams's emphasis that the story of the history of Christian doctrine and practice is a story not only of growth but also of decay. That reminder stops us confusing development with progress, it seems to me. I suggest after 37.5 minutes of concentrated wisdom to be digested by us all, that before I invite the third speaker to address us, just for 2 minutes, would you care all to disagree with each other? The continuity of Catholic tradition, those of you in acute discomfort can offer it up. It now gives me very great pleasure, thirdly, to ask Father John Beale from the Catholic University of America to speak on Weathering the Perfect Storm, the contribution of canon law.
In late October of 1991, a classic nor'easter began to rage over Sable Island, several hundred miles off the Nova Scotia coast. This would have been a nasty storm under the best of circumstances, but these were not to be the best of circumstances. A once-in-a-lifetime meteorological convergence caused the nor'easter to merge first with a weak hurricane, ironically named Grace, coming from the south, and then a massive Arctic cold front racing from the west. The result was a monster storm, with sustained winds of over 100 miles an hour, 12 on the Beaufort scale, and waves over 100 feet tall. This was, as you readers of Sebastian Junger and fans of George Clooney know, the perfect storm. As we near October of 2002, we may be about to witness a similar but rare convergence of powerful currents to form another perfect storm, not in the North Atlantic off the New England coast, but right here in Boston and throughout the United States. If it continues to develop, this new perfect storm will not be a meteorological phenomenon, but an ecclesiological crisis. The outrage occasioned by the revelation that hundreds of priests had sexually abused young people and that diocesan bishops had not acted decisively to remove these priests from ministry has created a storm. These all by themselves would have caused a nasty storm. However, this nasty storm is in the process of being joined from two different directions by two even more powerful storms, two historical grievances that have been swirling undercurrents in American church history since the 19th century. The first of these is the long-standing resentment of the lay faithful, but also, and more quietly, the lower clergy, at the lack of accountability, transparency, and opportunities for participation in church governance. This resentment surfaced most visibly in the long and bitter conflict over what church historians, usually writing from the point of view of the victors, have called lay trusteeism. Essentially, the lay trustees and their supporters demanded a significant role in the governance of their parishes and accountability and transparency in the pastor's administration and in the bishop's administration. Often this demand included the trustees' claim to authority to engage and dismiss their pastors. And conflicts with bishops often erupted over this issue into violent storms. Beginning with the First Plenary Council of Baltimore in 1831, the bishops gradually vanquished the lay trustees and wrenched from them control over church property. Nevertheless, the bishop's victory did not make the demand of the laity for accountability, transparency, and participation in governance disappear. It only pushed this swirling hurricane out to sea to drift harmlessly until the occasion presented itself for the storm to strengthen and latch on to another. And this opportunity presented itself this past January as reports multiplied here and elsewhere throughout the country of abusive priests being knowingly transferred to new parishes where they abused again, of parishioners being kept in the dark about the darker side of their priests' pasts and about the reasons for their sudden removals and disappearances, of confidential settlements with victims and large sums expended with no disclosure or public accounting. More generally, there was a wave of resentment at the appearance of abuse of discretion and arrogance of power on the part of bishops. As a result, the meandering hurricane that developed in the 19th century has gathered strength, and as it has converged with the sex abuse storm, achieved new ferocity. The other turbulent current, whose leading edge has only recently appeared on our ecclesial radar screens is the historic resentment of the lower clergy, and to a lesser extent their supporters among the laity, at the allegedly arbitrary and capricious treatment they receive from their diocesan bishops. The demands of presbyters for due process when accused of wrongdoing, for tenure in office, for voice in the selection of their bishops, and for the imposition of canon law to rein in the episcopal arbitrariness in the United States is part of the long, sad history of the struggle between priests and bishops that is a very large part of the history of the Catholic Church in this country in the 19th century. As they had in the lay trustee controversy, the bishops squelched their presbyters' challenge to their unfettered authority, but it was a triumph that left a high-pressure system of resentment and suspicion lurking just beyond the horizon. The USCCB's enactment in June of a charter and essential norms for dealing with the complaints of sexual abuse and subsequent attempts to implement these norms have created the conditions for this massive high to come roaring over the horizon into the already ferocious hurricane. In short, if these gales continue on their present course, their convergence will place us at the eye of another perfect storm. Canon law has a rather modest and mundane contribution to make to weathering this coming storm. It is modest, and it provides what we might call the basic rules of seamanship. The things we need to do to keep this storm from turning us into another Andrea Gale. I'd like to look at two areas where canon law can make a contribution. Neither of them are particularly sexy. One is the administration of the temporal goods of the church. The other is disciplinary procedure. I picked the administration of temporal goods because it raises no particularly significant theological problems, but also because it touches on one of the areas that has received some of the most vehement complaints over these last 9 months. The complaint has been the church has responded to this storm like another corporation. And indeed, the handling of the cases by bishops and their public relations flacks has looked suspiciously like the handling of the misdeeds of Enron and some of the other corporate scandals of this year. As a matter of fact, it's a question of which corporate scandals were going to make the front page of today's paper for much of the last month. One of the things that canon law can do is point out that part of our problem is that the church has chosen to structure itself in our society through the vehicle of civil law corporations that do not very well reflect the canonical and underlying theological reality of what the church is. The most notorious of these is the system used here in the Archdiocese of Boston and elsewhere throughout the United States of corporation sole, where all of the church property is held owned, administered, and alienated without fetters by the office of the Archbishop that has been given civil law status. Even in places where the model of corporation sole is not available for the church to structure itself, bishops act as if they were corporation sole. Canon law, on the other hand, sees each of those individual worshiping communities of the faithful that we usually call parishes as distinct and somewhat autonomous juridic persons or corporations that are in communion with and are supervised by the diocesan bishop, but they are not his. Our present corporate structures do not honor the canonical and theological integrity of the local communities. And if we want to bring accountability and transparency and participation in church governance, then we need to change the structures. And changing those structures to more adequately reflect canon law would entail other things, like building in statutes. None of our parishes or dioceses have their own statutes, in large part because of the somewhat accidental way that we got canonical parishes in this country for the first time in 1918. Parish statutes would spell out the lines of authority and accountability of pastors to lay people and the role of lay people in setting the budgets, the financial priorities, and reviewing the annual accounts. If we're going to take that direction toward bringing our corporate structures more into line with canon law, then we might also look at the way we govern the church. Do we want a huge diocesan bureaucracy to funnel down knowledge, wisdom, rules, and other things, but rarely money, that goes the other direction, to the local parish communities for them to do what they're told? Or do we want to set missions for our parishes that will include some provisions that keep them from becoming too parochial, and then allow them to work things out for themselves? Work out their own religious education programs, their own interactions between Catholic school and religious education, their own youth programs, either individually or together with other parishes and nearby communities. In other words, if we're going to respect canonically the integrity and relative autonomy of the parish community, maybe we ought to make the bishop truly the exerciser of episcopae or supervisory authority. No major changes in canon law would be required to effect these changes. It would require a change of minds and hearts. The other area where we need to draw on the wisdom of our canonical tradition is in developing fair procedures for dealing, first of all, with priests who have been accused of misconduct. In the present climate, we've gone from the extreme of doing nothing, or next to nothing, to conducting what I describe elsewhere as kangaroo courts, where you are guilty until proven innocent, where you have very limited right to defend yourself, and you may not even know your accuser, let alone have an opportunity to face him. We can do better. And I emphasize the importance of developing fair procedures for priests, because if we don't develop them for the clergy, we will never develop them for the numerous lay people who have close encounters of the wrong kind with administrative authorities in the church. Catholic school teachers, catechists, and all the rest who have had difficulties and have not been able to find due process. These are two areas where we need a change of mind and a change of heart, and where I believe canon law can make a contribution.
Thank you, John, very much indeed. 2 or 3 years ago, I was giving some lectures in the fledgling Catholic University of Notre Dame in Fremantle in Western Australia, and I noticed there was quite a lot of unease, of discontent amongst the faculty. And I asked one of my hostesses, I said, could I have a look at your statutes at the university? We'd never read the statutes, but she found a copy, and I was deeply, deeply shocked by those statutes, because what they amounted to in effect was that any questions about appointment or dismissal or the structuring of departments were wholly and solely at the whim of the Archbishop of Perth. Corporation so. Finally, it gives me great pleasure to ask Sister Mary Ann Hinsdale to spell out to us the resources from the Second Vatican Council.
I have no movie allusions or great stories. However, I do have a very battered edition of the Second Vatican Council documents that were given to me when I graduated from high school in 1965. I lived through the council, and so I'm dating myself, I realize, but you'll know, as you can see, in a sense, how important this was, at least in my life. And it's a very good exercise, in a sense, to go back to these documents. We're still celebrating the 40th anniversary of Vatican II, and I'll give a shameless plug for an event that the Institute is sponsoring on October 11th, the actual opening day of the Council, which will include an intergenerational panel in the afternoon. That's a Friday afternoon, slow time, I know, on campus, responding to some of the experts who are at the Council, October 11th. My task this evening is to speak about the laity's role in church governance by appealing to some of the resources from Vatican II. The most significant documents from Vatican II concerning the laity in this regard, I think, are three in the main: Lumen Gentium, the dogmatic constitution on the church; Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world; and Apostolicam Actuatiotem, the decree on the apostolate of the laity. However, there are other documents as well, notably the dogmatic constitution on divine revelation, the dogmatic constitution on the sacred liturgy, the decree on the instruments of social communication, the declaration on Christian education, the decree on the bishop's pastoral office, the decree on priestly life, and the decree on missionary activity, and the decree on ecumenism, all of which necessarily speak of the role of the laity in the church. Now, you can breathe a sigh of relief. I'm not going to go through all of those documents tonight, and I hope to spare you from a lot of long quotes. I want you to talk about five things. I'm going to have a fifth instead of the four that my colleagues have set the precedent for. First, I'd like to talk about three major decisions which I think made Vatican II a council of the laity. Secondly, I want to look at who it says the laity are. Third, what it has to say about the power of the laity. Fourth, what Vatican II has to say about the proper sphere of the laity, and then I will look at some of my suggestions towards necessary structural forms that need to be implemented or changes, and that will be where I get a little programmatic. So the first 4 points actually are simply, in a historical way, unfolding what Vatican II has to say about laity. John Nilsson, the current president of the Catholic Theological Society of America, reminds us that because of 3 major decisions, Vatican II became the Council of the Laity. First, the bishops at Vatican II rejected the preparatory schema on the Church that had been submitted by the Curia because it largely summarized the juridical and hierarchical approach that characterized pre-conciliar ecclesiology. If you'd like a good, readable sort of entree into this, I recommend Cardinal Suhonen's memoir, Memories and Hopes, which was published in English in 1992, as also the Council Daybooks, which recount the goings-on of the Council by the pseudonymous Xavier Rinn. A second decision that was made was that the bishops voted to place Chapter 3 on the hierarchical constitution of the Church after the chapters on the mystery of the Church and the chapter on the people of God in the document on the Constitution on the Church. And their purpose in doing that was to underline that since the fundamental reality of the Church is communion with God and with one another, every member of the Church shares a basic equality, dignity, and call, which are grounded in baptism, confirmation, and Eucharist. Those of you who were here last week heard Father Cunin speak about that. This is also why Chapter 4 of the Constitution on the Church begins with this quote, "Everything which has been said so far concerning the people of God applies equally to the laity, religious, and clergy." That's in Lumen Gentium number 30. The third decision was to devote a separate document to the laity in order to affirm and enhance the life of the ordinary Catholic. Now, the implementation of that decision was fairly difficult because, as I've already mentioned in giving that list of documents, the laity had been previously treated as a subject in previous documents. One sees this particularly in a footnote to the decree on the apostolate of the laity, which mentions all of those documents that I referred to a minute ago. So those 3 decisions are important in terms of making Vatican II Council of the Laity. The second point, who are the laity? Those of you, again, who were with us the first panel that we had in this series heard Dr. Francine Cardamon remind us, quoting Newman, that the answer to that question, who are the laity, that Newman gave, is that the Church would look foolish without them. However, at Vatican II, Lumen Gentium Article 31 defines laity as the following: all the faithful except those in holy orders and those in a religious state sanctioned by the Church. These faithful are, by baptism, made one body with Christ and are established among the people of God. They are in their own way made sharers or participators, is another way you could translate that from the Latin, in the priestly, prophetic, and kingly functions of Christ. They carry out their own part in the mission of the whole Christian people with respect to the Church and the world. Now, this is not a minimal nor a negative description. In other words, it doesn't say the laity are the non-ordained or the non-vowed. In fact, Vatican II declared that there was a diversity of ministry but a unity of mission with regard to the Church. Each, lay and ordained, is necessary to the mission of the Church, and so they must cooperate with one another and serve one another for the good of the Church and the world. The mission of the Church does not rest on the shoulders of the ordained alone, and here in the text I have citations to various articles of both Lumen Gentium, the Constitution on the Church, and the Decree on the Apostolate of the Laity. Both clergy and laity participate in Christ's roles, as Father Himes already brought out, of prophet, priest, and king, but do so differently. The common priesthood of the faithful and the ministerial or hierarchical priesthood differ, according to the Council, quote, in essence and not only in degree. What is important to remember here, I think, is that the council did not specify what that difference was. Now, often the adjective sacred is used in conjunction with the word pastors in the council documents, but the council affirms that the mission of the church is done mainly through the ministry of word and the sacraments, entrusted in a special way to the clergy, and that the bishops and their assistants, the priests, are to order and coordinate the various ministry and apostolates of the laity. They have the task, that is, the bishops and the priests, of discerning, judging, and ordering the charisms of the Spirit. And here I point especially to the Constitution on the Church, Article 12, 23, and 24. In this understanding, we might say that, in fact, what this panel is all about, the laity have no official role in the governance of the church. Without the sacrament of orders, they are unable to exercise jurisdiction. In councils and synods, their participation and vote is consultative, not legislative. The bishop is the only legislator in a diocesan synod. Third point, getting now to the power of the laity. So the issue is, can the laity exercise power in the church in other ways? The answer is yes, according to Vatican II. But there's still another question lurking beneath this one. And that is the question which has been addressed by my three predecessors on the panel. Are these ways sufficient for the mission of the church and the true realization of the vocation of the laity? I'm going to leave some of that judgment there about whether they're sufficient to our question time and conversation that will take place when I'm finished. However, John Nilsson, building on the work of other ecclesiologists such as Patrick Granfield and Canon Osborne, note the following 5 points that he derives from reading the Vatican II documents. First, this is in terms of the laity's power. The laity, by reason of their competence, can make their opinions known to the pastors about the good of the church. In fact, Lumen Gentium Article 37 urges and even obliges them to do that. For the sake of time, I'm not going to read the quote, but if you're interested, I can bring it up later. Secondly, the laity can utilize the Spirit's gifts for the unity of the church and the vitality of its mission. This is particularly true in their participation in the ecumenical conversations that grew out of the Second Vatican Council. Third, their study, contemplation, and experience contribute to the development of tradition in the church. And this, of course, was alluded to already by Michael Himes in terms of what he had to share with us about the sensus fidelium. Fourth, I'm talking about power now all through this, they are united with Christ's offering of himself to God, as is the priest, in their full conscious and active participation in liturgical celebrations. Fifth, and most characteristically, however, the laity exercise their power in their mission to the world. As the Constitution on the Church, Article 33 says, quote, "Only through them can the church be the salt of the earth." And again in Lumen Gentium, Article 31, quote, "The laity by their very vocation seek the reign of God by engaging in temporal affairs and ordering them according to the plan of God," end quote. This vocation is a summons. It's a call to a distinctive way of life and fosters both the good of the individual and the community. It is a summons that comes through baptism, is strengthened by confirmation, and is sustained by the Eucharist. The decree on the apostolate of the laity goes on to say, quote, "They, the laity, are assigned to the apostolate by the Lord himself," end quote. This is important because it's a correction to the pre-conciliar teaching that was known as Catholic action, especially promoted by Pius XI and Pius XII, that understood Catholic action to be the participation of the laity in the work of the hierarchy. Lumen Gentium, the Constitution on the Church, clearly says that the laity's apostolate is a participation in the saving mission of the Church itself, without going through or being ordered under the hierarchy. My fourth point concerns the proper sphere of the laity according to the documents of Vatican II. This issue is one that is increasingly being contested in today's theology of ministry in the Church. And I think it's important to note that the council did not mark out the world as the realm of the laity and the church as the realm of the ordained in any hard and fast way. Where it does make those points, it is giving a description rather than a definition. For those who are not ordained certainly can have important functions within the church's ministry. And we see this very much today through the last 40 years especially, but today in terms of areas like catechesis, liturgy, pastoral care, church administration, as well as a cryptic phrase for a spiritual purpose. The laity has an important function in the church. Nevertheless, despite that reality, temporal affairs, according to Vatican II, are to be the realm of the laity's vocation, and their role, the laity's role, is to order them according to the distinction. In any case, temporal affairs are to be the realm of the laity's vocation, and their role is to order them according to the plan of God. The laity are the experts in this regard and ought not to expect that the clergy have the answer to every question which mission to the world might raise. So, the lay vocation constitutes a whole way of life. There is now, as we've seen over the last decade, something called a lay spirituality, and there is also increasingly a lay formation for ministry that is being developed. If there is diversity of ministry but unity of mission in the church, and the laity are assigned to the apostolate by Christ himself, my 3-minute warning. Can I have an extra for the paper from me? Thank you. Then the ordained have obligations to the laity. The laity also have the right, according to Vatican II, to receive an abundance of spiritual goods of the church, especially the Word of God and the sacraments. The laity have the right and duty, according to Vatican II, to express their views on the matters relating to the good of the church and the clergy. In fact, the clergy must establish the means for the laity to do this. If this is true, then not only should groups such as Call to Action, Voice of the Faithful, Dignity, Opus Dei, Communio et Liberazione be allowed to meet on church property, but the hierarchy must strive to encourage and support them in these endeavors. Vatican II is clear that the clergy are to offer light and support, but not an answer to every problem that arises. My colleague Tom Groom last week said a lot about the apostolate of marriage and family in speaking of the domestic church. And it's true that a major sphere of the laity's mission in the church is in the domestic church, in the family. However, the documents also point out that a strong family can extend influence outside the home in many ways and should. In order to do this, the laity must receive the proper education and formation to be prepared for the demands of their vocation. I think it is a legitimate expectation of the laity that the church subsidize the laity's education for the exercise of their apostolate, just as it does those preparing for ordained ministry. The decree on the apostolate of the laity, number 6, because of time I won't read it, but you can check it out, challenges the church to provide resources for the lay apostolate. Sunday Mass alone, with its less than inspiring and intellectually stimulating homilies, is not enough to equip the laity to be able to fulfill the demanding role that is theirs. The last point is my programmatic suggestions for necessary structural reforms. Vatican II obviously did not make the structural reforms to implement its vision of a laity that collaboratively and reciprocally engages with the clergy in carrying out the mission of the church in the world. There were a few post-conciliar steps. One, the institution of a council on the laity in 1967, which later was elevated to the status of a pontifical council in 1976. However, this organ still today is administered largely by clerics. So without a representative voice for the laity in the church's administration, it seems doubtful if this structure can in fact serve the role Vatican II intended for the laity. The Synod on the Laity, held in 1987, held out some initial hopes. Preparatory consultations were held all over the world. The Apostolic exhortation, however, that John Paul II issued after that synod did not grapple with many of the radical questions which were raised in the consultations, and in fact seemed more bent on regulating and controlling the level of lay activity in the Church. And this, in fact, still seems, as has already been alluded this evening, to be the case with even more recent documents that seek to shore up the role of the laity, particularly in terms of where the laity can exercise the ministry of the Word, presiding in the liturgy, conferring baptism, distributing the Eucharist, always only in necessity. And in fact, Christi Fidelis Laicae reaffirms the exclusion of women from the priesthood and maintains that the Pope and the Curia have the primary role in the formation of laity. So since the Council, in fact, the distinction between clergy and the faithful has actually been reasserted, even as that distinction has become more problematic theologically and practically. In fact, lay submission to the ordained has more become the ideal and the norm. The Vatican argues that true communion was being damaged by blurring the lines between the ordained and the non-ordained in some of its recent statements, and it speaks out against what is called a clericalization of the laity, instead of recognizing that these traditional categories, clergy and laity, need to be re-examined in light of contemporary experience. And I will stop here, and I leave my other 2 points to the questions and comments. Thank you.